Hi everybody. I'm very excited to talk about what's happening in the workplace at the moment with all of you and what we have learned over the last year or so after the bulk of the lockdown was over. I'll tell you a little bit about myself so you understand who I am, and then we'll dive right into the topic. So I'm an architect by training. I've worked in both architecture and interior design for the best part, actually, over a decade now. I started working in very large scale projects, master plans, developer-led housing, as well as private high-end residential, commercial interiors for retail, hotels, and hospitality, and so on. In a former life, I used to head Tom Dixon's interior design business, where we did very high-end projects all over the world, before moving into the workplace world, where I worked with a number of startups in different real estate based startups who were designing meeting rooms and very innovative workplaces all around the globe. And now I've got the great pleasure of working at Kitt and heading the design team here. So at Kitt, we talk, as Patrick said, we talk to so many businesses. All we do is offices and workplaces. So we have learned quite a lot in the last few months about what's going on, what people need, what has changed to what's been going on before the pandemic. So we thought now is actually a great time to speak to people in this situation where they might feel like the existing space doesn't work so well anymore and they need a change, or they're looking for a new space, on what to pay attention to. So as mentioned, we have got a massive change, a really rapid and quite big change that has been happening in the last few years. It's really, the pandemic has been such a catalyst for trends that have been happening anyway, but it's just the speed has just been incredible. We all know what working from home means. So most office-based businesses now have adapted what's called a mix from work from home and working from the office. So we call it hybrid working, clubhouse working, hoteling. There's a few different terms that have been used. In the UK, the most common term is hybrid working, which is what we're going to call it from here on in this webinar. And we have also learned from our clients that there's a ton of uncertainty on what to do with their space, because pre-pandemic, the default place to go to work was the office. Now there's so many options. There's the home, there's the office. Some people like to work in third spaces. So the space has to change to adapt to that. So at Kitt, I'll give you a super quick overview of what we do and why we know a little bit about this. We offer a full service, meaning going from real estate to legals, design and fit out. But we also service offices, which means we stay in touch with clients after they move in, which means we can also adjust their spaces as and if they need to. So the learnings out of what has changed since pre-pandemic have been really quick and very direct. So why do people still have an office? The role of the office as the default place of work has changed. So what is the office now? What we've learned is the office is an investment for different companies. And after working from home, I think what offices have learned, what businesses have learned, is that having a great office helps. We've learned that firsthand, and there's been a bunch of studies as well. But it's a real bonus, a real benefit for increasing productivity, for attracting new talent, retaining existing employees, and also to reduce stress for the existing staff. So getting the office space right can have massive benefits in all those 4 points. The office is also a really important social anchor. We all know a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting, all those virtual encounters are incredibly task-based. So you schedule a meeting to do a very specific thing and talk of a very specific point. We're completely missing those unscheduled and unstructured social moments that happen in a face-to-face working environment. It's actually been a Microsoft study in 2020, where they measured how long it takes to solve a problem when there's a purely virtual environment versus a in-person environment. And the difference, I can't remember the actual number, it was like 1.8 times longer in a virtual environment. In-person in-person workplaces increase commitment, support, and teamwork. So they're really good for knitting together your teams. A lot of mentoring happens while you're around people who are doing what you're learning to do, who are working in the same role as you, especially for younger staff members, for junior staff, and for people who are new to the business. It's much, much easier to understand what your role is than it is in person, than it is when you're in front of a computer screen at home. So this unstructured collaboration piece is really hard to achieve in a virtual environment. Then there's a term that's been coined in the last few years, which is called human moments. So what that means really, it's part of a cultural shift. So we've got a general shift to a human-centered culture in the workplace, which means that we have learned that these subtle advantages comes from being face-to-face really matter. So we build way more around the human needs that people have, and that makes them really productive and happy. So in short, the human moments build and support relationships. So studies have shown that they increase alignments in teams of shared values, goals, and culture. They reinforce behaviors and the soft skills that we want to see from our workforces. They instill a feeling of inclusion and belonging, and they bring employees together. So how can we actually support that with spatial design? The first point we normally look at is openness versus privacy. So what I mean by that is collaboration on days that teams are in the office is super important, and actually that is what the office should be used for. However, if you go too extreme into all open spaces, all collaborative areas, there's a complete central overload, and also nobody can collaborate for 8 hours. So there needs to be a balance between open, communal, collaborative spaces, and then places where people are allowed to focus and not talk to anybody else and actually get things done that they need to do by themselves. So that balance needs to be carefully considered. Sort of feeding into that is acoustics. Everybody who has worked in a space or spent lots of time in a space that's really echoey, really loud, where you can hear conversations that are happening next door, considers that. People who've only experienced really great acoustic spaces tend to forget. It's one of those things you only realize when it's done badly. But if it's done badly, it can be incredibly distracting. So it's not really a nice to have, but it's hugely important. So there's actually very intentional applications for acoustics. One is in places where you want to have those focused work time, you want to have one-on-one conversations, you want to have privacy. They need to create great acoustics. What I mean by that is acoustic privacy, where nobody can overhear and where all of the echo is taken away. But then there are also areas where you kind of want to create an atmosphere. So you might want to have background music, you might want to have just not very many absorbent surfaces, like in a coffee shop. You want to have an atmosphere that's not too quiet. It can feel really weird. So that might be more appropriate for social spaces in the office, for the kitchen and so on. So that is an important aspect of creating those human moments. Encouraging connection is a very obvious one. Kind of coming back to the last point, informal learning and socializing is one of the real strong points of being together. And what we have been seeing is that there's a lot of need for what people think are flexible spaces. And what they mean by that is it needs to be a space where everybody can come together and have things like team lunches, they can have presentations, they can have all hands meetings, they can do non-working activities like workshops and yoga classes and things like that. So then this is rituals that they create around their work that are a little bit more formalized now than they used to be, because people are not together so much. So they utilize the time a little bit more effectively. So the office needs to have spaces to allow for that. At the same time, there cannot just be big empty areas that are used 10% of the time. So there needs to be consideration for both of those. And in order to create these connections, we need to also role model it from the leadership team. So that's actually true for many, many cultural changes and shifts that we want to create. The leadership team has to role model all of those in order for them to actually really happen. So thanks for getting started. What should you think about if you want to make a change in your existing space, or if you're looking for a new space? These are really typical questions that we get asked all the time by clients and by people who are just kind of thinking about their new spaces. So the first really daunting question is, how much space do you need? Most people don't really understand how many square meters or square feet they need for X amount of people. So there's really easy ways to help you along with that. But at the same time, it's also a really difficult question because it completely depends on how you work and how your business works. So a few things to bear in mind. One is you can use online space calculators. There's quite a few around. We have got one on our Kitt website as well. That will help you sort of get a gauge of what you need. There's also an easy rule of thumb, again, very much depending on how you work. And it's about 8 to 10 square meters per person. The other two things that are really important to understand is if you've got, let's say, a big open space with very few columns, that's very regularly shaped, like a rectangular square, much easier and much more efficient than, let's say, a 4-story small building in Soho. That's like a townhouse with lots of stairs and small floor plates. You will always need a little bit more space when you've got a small space like that. Then the next thing is the brief. So that's what we normally do with our clients, but it's something as a client you can think about ahead of time. Or if you don't work with a designer, it's still worth writing a brief for yourself to understand what are the priorities. So we normally divide up the briefing process into a functional and an aesthetic brief. The functional brief is all the things we need to consider to make the space work and function for your business. So here's a few questions that we normally ask. Do you have clients to visit the space? Does it need to impress? Does it need to re-represent you? Or is it actually a very private space? You don't really have clients in the country, or it's just not the type of business. So you don't need to invest in a big welcome area and a big impressive reception, perhaps. How do you work? Do you work very collaboratively? Do you work focused? Do you have a big showroom that you need to create for clients? Is the office your showcase? That all has an effect on how much space you need and what kind of space you need. Then we already spoke about acoustics. So there's like little things that often come, if we don't ask them ahead of time, you don't consider them ahead of time. It's all day 2 works that happen after you've moved in and nobody's allowed for it. And they're kind of annoying and don't make the space work very well. So things like acoustics, storage, access to daylight should be all things to think about before you even select a new space. Then to understand what should change is analyzing where you're at is a really good starting point. So what works really well in your space at the moment and what doesn't is a great starting point to understand what you should create more of and what you should avoid creating in the new space. Pay attention to what areas get used. So there's always spaces like a bank of desks near the window, or a meeting room with really great ventilation and lighting, or a certain high table that people seem to be using all the time. So that's a really good observation to make, to understand what people like and what areas don't really get used is an important one as well. Then does your business need anything very specific to what you do? So we have designed all kinds of special areas, like different security areas, product testing areas, showrooms, game rooms, all those fun spaces. Then also think about what rituals you have. We just talked about things like team lunches and all hands and things like that. We have gaming areas, wellness areas, places for non-working activities, nap rooms. Is there some cultural thing? Is there a ritual that you want to create or that you already do, and you need a space to house, to be a container for it? The second part to the briefing is the aesthetic brief. So it's a lot less prescribed, and it's where working with a designer is really helpful, because we're really skilled at asking the right questions and understanding things like your business's mission, your values, your branding. How do you want to be perceived externally and internally, and what's your branding identity as well? So all those things that are quite hard to grasp need to be translated into things like materials, colors, lighting, furniture. All of those things are actually kind of not a one-to-one translation, but that's what designers do. That they end up soaking up a lot of information and then actually bringing it together with you to make sure that your new home actually represents who you are and who you want to be and how you want to be seen. Then how to shortlist spaces? So that's also a question we get quite often. What to pay attention to, though. One thing is kind of the real estate aspect, things like what amenities are in the building nearby, what's the location, what are the public transport hubs nearby and stuff like that. But we'll focus more on the building related aspects. So one really important part is what's the condition of the existing building. Everything that's already there and that's actually right for you or very close to right, we can reuse. So that cuts a big chunk out of your bill. So things like restrooms, kitchens, what lighting's there. Are there any meeting rooms that are already built and then might work for you? And then little things like server room, storage, things like that, are bike stores. All of that, if it already exists, it means you don't have to pay for creating it, or even communal facilities like showers and things like that. You don't have to create a new space. Then sometimes we also find that spaces have existing furniture that's already there. Sometimes it's really useful to use that, and it's a way to cut down the bill. So make sure it's the right condition and the right style. And then lastly, if you bring any of your, or if you're planning to bring any of your own furniture, make sure it fits in. Sometimes we have found that clients have a really big boardroom table and there's already a meeting room there and it just doesn't quite fit through the door. And lastly, consider your team's needs. So ask your staff what they would like in the new space, or what they would like to change in the existing space. It's a really, especially when you've got a larger company, it's quite tricky to ask everybody. So there's different ways of doing it. You can ask all team leads to gather feedback. At Kitt, we have developed a few different types of surveys that we send out, some to the leadership team and then another one for all staff. And they often uncover really interesting things that their managers don't always pick up. So it's really worthwhile. And I feel like every time we do that, there's also a really big buy-in from the teams, and they support decisions that are made a lot more easily if they feel heard. So here we've got a summary of all the tips that we've just gone through, just to capture. Work out how much space you need. Consider what functional elements you need in the space. Consider what the space is supposed to feel and how it should express who you are and how you want to be perceived. How do you shortlist potential locations that the real estate agent has shown you? And talk to your team. Understand what they want and need. To close, we have put together a case study of one of our spaces that we finished at the end of last year, early this year, for a company called ICP. So this is a creative agency. They came to us with a brief that was centered around creativity and clients. So they found when they were working online over the pandemic, they really lost the creative edge that they rely on in their work. And they had a gut feeling that they need to be together face to face a lot more in order to sort of spark that creativity again. They're very client focused, and clients come into the office a lot. So the office needed to feel really client facing and very presentable. And also they are growing really quickly, so they needed to make sure that if they need to change something, they can adapt the space really easily over time. So you can see on the right-hand side, there's an image of one of the open plan spaces. You probably notice there's a lot of soft furniture. Some of it is movable. There's a mix of soft furniture with laptop tables to make those spaces actually really useful. And there's some high tables, there's a meeting room in the back, and you can also see some desks in the background. So there's a huge mix of spaces, and it's almost like a residential feel that we've created for them to make it very comfortable, make it very client friendly. So what have we done? One of the interesting facts about this office is the ratio between traditional desks and kind of all the other seats that we have got. So there's soft seating, there's high benches, there's stools. So we've got 26 desks and we've got over 100 seats that are something else across the whole office. Then we have paid attention to the welcome area, which you can see on the right-hand side here. So they've got very subtle branding. We've brought in their brand color and we've brought in their logo, which is super prominent and very minimal, which is very true to this client's brand. And then we've also brought the whole office is very open and playful, which is again very much their brand and also what they need to kind of have those creative moments. But there's also separate rooms and nooks and little areas where people can go and work quietly. There's also a bunch of phone booths that people can use to take phone calls so that disturb everybody else. So that is the end of our presentation, but I think there might be, do we have any questions, Patrick?
Yeah, we've got a few pre-submitted ones. If there's any others that pop up in the Q&A, I'll take a look there too. Yes, just having a look through here. So we have one submitted that says, do you have any tips on creating an echo-free space in a glass meeting room? So I guess kind of similar to the acoustics point you made earlier.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so echo sound is a really tricky one. But if you've got a glass meeting room, so basically sound travels in waves, right? So you need to, they just bounce off hard surfaces. Somebody speaks, it bounces to the hard surface and it just keeps bouncing around an angle until it gets absorbed somewhere. So the way to really combat that is to create something soft that absorbs it before it bounces around the room. So if you look at the surface in a space, one of the biggest surfaces is the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. So an easy one is put a big rug under the table. That helps a little bit. Then there is on the image here, actually, we can see these sort of decorative elements. They're not just decorative, but they're actually acoustic baffles. So they are made from a very absorbent acoustic material. It's kind of like if you imagine a sound studio where they've got really padded walls and ceilings. It's that kind of stuff. So it's quite high performing. So that helps sound from bouncing up to the ceiling, coming back down. Just be aware that those baffles cannot be really far apart from one another or they don't really work so well. And they also have to have enough depth in order to function properly. There's also acoustic wall panels that are quite cost effective. They can be put on different walls. If you've got any solid walls, they can also be put behind screens like TV screens. And lastly, another tip is also to, if you want to create some acoustic as well as visual privacy, to use a curtain that can be pulled in front of one of the glass walls, so glass partitions. Use like a thick felty material that gives you some visual privacy, but also it will absorb some of the echo.
Awesome. Great. And then there's another one that says, do you have any advice on creating a space that balances collaborative working for meetings and calls, as well as desk working areas when in an open plan office without people being distracted or disturbed?
Right. So it's a tricky question. Unless you want to, obviously one answer is to actually create different rooms. So you've got an actual room that's a focus room, and another space that is for collaboration that allows for people being louder. That's not always possible because not everybody's able to build a wall or has the space for it. So another tip for creating something that becomes a little bit less distracting for the people who need peace and quiet is to think about different teams that have got different noise levels. So for example, the sales team tend to be noisier because they're on the phones all the time, whereas often the tech teams, for example, are less noisy because they sit down and have got long stretches of time where they need to focus. So arranging your office from quiet to less quiet is a good idea. So placing teams that are quieter close to one side and teams that are noisier close to the other side, that other side ideally being near social areas and communal areas. And then also allowing for some of these absorbing materials we just talked about in the last question, like there's a lot of freestanding movable screens that have got a lot of acoustic properties that different companies offer. Have them close to the people who need peace and quiet and focus, so they at least get a little bit of relief from the echo bouncing around. So that is the most cost-effective way of helping out. And then again, like having some sound absorbing materials, having rugs around, having some soft seating around is helpful just throughout the space.
Awesome. I guess to this one, it feels similar to almost like the theme around the acoustics and then being quite overlooked. But someone else has asked, are there any other things that people will commonly overlook when selecting a new space?
What do people commonly overlook? I think one of the things that that people should pay attention to is light. Acoustics are important, but lighting is also really important. Having a really good ambient light. So by ambient light, I mean the lights that give you sort of your general illumination versus feature lights that are like pendants and wallets and things like that. So making sure that there's enough light is great, but also pay attention to the light temperature. So the light temperature means how basically white or yellow is your light. So the higher the number, the whiter the light. I think we've all been to an office or to often it is actually offices and commercial spaces that have got, you feel like you're inside a refrigerator because it's so white and it kind of doesn't feel nice. Whereas so that'd be like a, I don't know, 9,000 K as a Kelvin is the unit that we measure this in light. Whereas then I think you can all know these like super yellow lights that have very low light temperature that just feel not appropriate for an office. So we normally work with 3,000 or 4,000 K that just gives you enough illumination and it feels nice. But that's one of the things to pay attention to. Having to replace all of the lights is quite costly, but sometimes necessary if it just feels too cold and too uncomfortable for people.
Yeah, I can definitely say I've been in offices like that over the past few years for sure. Cool. So we've just got one more here, which I think is probably along the lines of those maybe people that are looking to redesign their current space, or maybe have got a bit of a smaller budget and are just looking to be a bit more creative with what they have. Someone's asked, how can I make my office more personal for my business?
So for that, if you try and do it on a smaller budget, think about your brand and think about the color scheme that you use. For example, painting walls is really cheap. It's really cost effective. Don't go overboard, but introducing some color on the walls is a great way of making it a little bit more yours. Also, some types of branding are really cost effective. Things like vinyl on the walls. Some people like to just bring their values into the space so that it's kind of visible and around people. If you want to, if you can use accessories that are along your brand colors, along the right types of accessories that work for your business. Books are a really good way of doing it. That's all of those sort of small, quite cost-effective things are a really good way to not spend too much money.
Awesome. Great. Well, those are all of the questions we have. Just check the Q&A thing and there's nothing in there for now. So I think we'll finish there.